My name is Jeremiah Wallace. At 72 years old, I've learned that the loudest threats are rarely the most dangerous. It's the silence that follows that you have to watch for. My son-in-law Brandon gave me a choice: act as a servant in the home I built with my own hands, or leave. My daughter, my only child, Alicia, stood right beside him and said nothing. The silence in that moment was deafening. So I smiled, packed a single suitcase, and walked out the front door. They thought they were getting rid of a tired old man. They had no idea they had just activated a plan my late wife Diane put in motion 5 years ago. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Let me know in the comments below, and please consider liking this video and subscribing if you believe in standing up for your own legacy. The three of us sat at the dinner table, the one I built from a single slab of oak the year Alicia was born. The clink of Brandon's fork against his plate was sharp, impatient. He was talking about his latest real estate venture using words like disruption and leveraging assets. I just listened, feeling the solid weight of the wood beneath my elbows. This house, it holds more than just memories. It holds the echo of my wife Diane's laughter, the scent of sawdust from my workshop, the very foundation of our lives. I moved in with them after Diane passed. Alicia had insisted. "We need to take care of you, Daddy," she'd said. But over the last year, taking care of me had started to feel a lot like managing an inconvenient piece of furniture. Brandon gestured with his knife. "It's a different world now, Jerry. You can't just build your way to success anymore. It's all about vision, about seeing the whole board." He looked at me, a flicker of pity in his eyes. He saw a man who worked with his hands, not his head. He had no idea that my hands remember every joint, every nail, every secret this house holds. My daughter Alicia just offered everyone more mashed potatoes. That was her way now. Filling the silence with small, meaningless things to avoid the cracks that were forming right under our feet. I kept my gaze on my plate, but I could feel the grain of the table, the story of the tree it came from. Every man builds a legacy. Brandon thought his was made of spreadsheets and contracts. He was about to find out mine was built of something far more permanent. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Brandon stood by the fireplace holding his wine glass like a trophy. He cleared his throat and the air thickened. This was his stage. "So," he began, "next Friday we're hosting a little mixer here. Some very important investors are flying in. This is the deal that could put us on a whole new level." He didn't ask, he announced. His eyes scanned the room he now considered his, and they landed on the coffee table in the center. I made that table the year Diane and I were married. Carved a small hidden heart on the underside of it. Brandon pointed with his glass. "That coffee table. It's beautiful, Jerry, really. Great craftsmanship." He paused, letting the compliment hang in the air before poisoning it. "But it's a bit rustic for the vibe we're going for. We'll need to move it to the garage for the night." He said it so casually, as if he were talking about a misplaced magazine. He wanted to hide a piece of my history, a piece of my heart, to make room for his ambition. Alicia shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, but she stayed quiet. I just nodded, feeling nothing on the outside. But on the inside, I felt a lock click into place. It was the sound of a door closing, a door I didn't even realize was still open. I looked at the table, at the faint scratches and water rings that told the story of a lifetime, and I knew this wasn't about a piece of furniture anymore. This was about everything. And the worst part of the evening hadn't even begun. The next morning, the smell of cedar and sawdust in my workshop was my only comfort. This small space behind the house was my sanctuary, the one place Brandon hadn't tried to redesign. My tools hung on the walls, each in its proper place, a history of a life spent creating. I was running my hand over the half-finished frame of a rocking chair when the shadow fell over the doorway. It was Brandon. Alicia hovered a few steps behind him, a nervous ghost in her own backyard. Brandon walked in like he owned the place, his expensive leather shoes out of place on the dusty concrete floor. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He never did. "Jerry," he started, his voice smooth and practiced, the one he used for business. "Alicia and I were talking, and we think we found a way for you to be a part of the big night." I stayed silent, my hand resting on the curved wood of the chair. He took my silence as an invitation to continue. "We need the event to feel seamless, professional. We'd like you to help out. Wear a white shirt, black pants, maybe help the bartender with drinks, make sure the guests have what they need." He smiled as if offering me a great honor. I finally turned to look at him, then at my daughter. Alicia was staring intently at a crack in the concrete as if it held all the answers in the world. I turned my eyes back to Brandon. My voice was low, but every tool on the wall seemed to vibrate with it. Brandon, I am a carpenter. I am a father. I am the man who built the roof over your head. I am not a servant. Not in this house, not in any house. The smile on Brandon's face didn't vanish. It tightened. It became something sharp. All right, he said, dropping the friendly act. Let's make it simple then. The investors are coming. We need this to be perfect. You are either a part of the team or you are in the way. Help us or make yourself scarce until it's over. That's the choice. My heart, a tired old muscle, beat a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. I looked past Brandon to my daughter. I searched her face for a flicker of defiance, a shadow of the girl I raised who stood up for the stray dogs and the picked-on kids at school. I searched for my wife's strength in her eyes. But there was nothing. She wouldn't meet my gaze. She just stood there, twisting her hands together, a silent partner to my humiliation. And that silence was the final turn of the screw. It was the quietest, most painful sound I had ever heard. I took a slow breath, letting the scent of wood fill my lungs one last time. I looked at Brandon's expectant face and then at my daughter's guilty shoes. A strange calm settled over me. The decision wasn't a decision at all. It was an answer that had been waiting for a question. I gave a small, slow nod. I understand, I said. The two words hung in the air and I could see Brandon relax, a smug little smirk playing on his lips. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd broken me. I turned away from them and walked out of my workshop, leaving the rocking chair unfinished. I walked across the lawn, my footsteps steady. Inside the house, I went straight upstairs to my room. There was no anger in my movements. Anger was a storm, loud and messy. This was something different. This was the cold, quiet pressure that builds deep in the earth before it moves mountains. I opened my closet and took out the old leather suitcase Diane and I had used on our honeymoon. I folded my shirts, my pants, my sweaters, placing each one inside with deliberate care. I picked up the silver frame photo of Diane from my nightstand. Her smile seemed to understand everything. I ran my thumb over the glass, a silent conversation between just the two of us. I didn't pack the photo. Her memory wasn't something I needed to carry. It was a part of me. Last, I walked to the closet and pulled out the one thing that mattered most, a thick leather-bound folder heavy with paper and purpose. I placed it gently on top of my clothes and closed the suitcase. The clicks of the latches were loud in the quiet room. I walked downstairs. They were in the living room, talking in low voices, probably planning the party. They stopped when they saw me with the suitcase in my hand. Brandon's smirk returned, thinking I was just making a dramatic show before coming to my senses. Alicia just looked pale, her eyes wide with a confusion she was too weak to voice. I didn't look at them. I didn't say a word. I walked past the coffee table they wanted to hide, past the fireplace where I'd told Alicia bedtime stories, and I went straight to the front door. The door I had hung myself, making sure it would never creak. It opened smoothly, and I stepped out into the afternoon sun. The door clicked shut behind me, a solid, final sound. They thought they had given me an ultimatum. They didn't realize they had just given me permission to begin. The motel room was clean, quiet, and had no memory. The walls were a pale, forgettable beige. The air conditioner hummed a low, steady note. It was the perfect place to disappear. I placed my old suitcase on the luggage rack, but I didn't open it to get my clothes. I reached inside and took out the only thing that mattered. Then I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, pulled my phone from my pocket, and held the power button down until the screen went black. The silence that followed was different from the silence in my daughter's house. This silence was mine. It was a tool. I moved to the small desk by the window, switched on the lamp, and laid the heavy leather folder on the worn surface. The spine of it was soft from age. On the front, in faded gold lettering, was one word: Diane. My wife was a planner. I built things with my hands, but she built worlds with her mind. She saw the whole structure while I was still measuring the first board. Opening the folder felt like having a conversation with her. The first page was a hand-drawn blueprint of our house, her handwriting elegant and precise in the margins. Tucked behind it were older, more brittle papers, photographs from the 1930s, showing my grandfather, a proud man in overalls, raising the first walls of the house with his own crew. There were newspaper clippings, land deeds, and pages upon pages of handwritten notes. I could almost hear her voice as I read the words she'd written 5 years ago, not long after her diagnosis. "A man who doesn't respect where something comes from," she had written, "will never understand its true value. He will only see what he can take, not what he should preserve." She had seen the weakness in Brandon back then, the soft rod of greed beneath his polished surface. This folder wasn't a weapon born of anger. It was a shield forged from foresight and love. It was her final act of protecting our family and our legacy. I spent an hour under that lonely lamp, rereading the plan she had laid out, the foundation she had secretly prepared. She had given me all the materials, all the instructions. It wasn't my job to be angry or hurt anymore. My job was to be the craftsman she always knew I was, to take her blueprint and build step by careful step. The room was anonymous, but I wasn't lost. For the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I was going. Back in the house, I built the house that knew my touch better than anyone's. Things began to come undone. It started small. A house, like a body, has its own rhythms, its own aches and pains that you only learn by living with it. The first sign was the sprinkler system on the lawn. I had it timed just right, a 10-minute cycle at dawn before the sun got too hot. The day after I left, it came on at 3 in the afternoon, soaking the mailman and flooding the flower beds Alicia's mother had planted. Brandon, I imagined, stood at the window cursing the technology he didn't understand. He probably spent an hour on his phone looking for a manual, getting angrier with every failed search, not knowing the control box had a loose wire that I used to jiggle just so every Sunday morning. Then came the dripping. The faucet in the upstairs bathroom had a slow, rhythmic drip that could drive a man insane if he wasn't used to it. I knew how to turn the handle to a very specific angle to make it stop. Brandon, I'm sure, tried to wrench it shut, which only made it worse, a tiny constant reminder that the master of the house was no longer the man living in it. Alicia started calling on the second day. The first call was probably out of a sense of duty. The fifth was laced with irritation. By the 10th, I could imagine the sound of her voice tight with a worry she wouldn't want to name. She wasn't worried about me. Not yet. She was worried about the smooth running of her life. She was worried about the party. The missed calls piled up on my dark screen, a silent testament to their growing chaos. 20 calls, 35. The number became a score, 48. A week before the party, a fuse blew in the kitchen. It was the old fuse that controlled the outlets for the refrigerator and the microwave. I kept a spare in the utility closet in a small tin box labeled fuses. Brandon probably went to the circuit breaker in the basement, flipping switches with increasing frustration, unable to understand why half the kitchen was dead while the other half was fine. I can almost picture him standing in the dark kitchen, the beam of his expensive smartphone flashlight cutting through the gloom, feeling utterly powerless. He was a man who moved millions of dollars with a click, but he couldn't make the refrigerator hum again. The caterers called, needing to confirm details. The florist needed to know where to set up. Every question, every small logistical problem became a fresh wave of stress. These were all things they had assumed I would handle, or at least be present for, the silent, reliable engine in the background of their lives. Now the engine was gone. The house was no longer a stage for their ambitions. It was becoming what it had always been beneath the surface, a complex organism of wood wire and pipe, an old friend of mine that refused to cooperate with strangers. The chaos wasn't loud. It was a quiet, creeping decay. It was the sound of a dripping faucet in a silent house. It was the sight of a beautiful lawn slowly turning yellow in patches. It was the feeling of a cold refrigerator. And on my silent phone, it was the number climbing steadily, relentlessly. 55 missed calls. Their carefully constructed world was beginning to fray at the seams, and they had no idea how to stitch it back together. On the 8th day of my self-imposed exile, I walked into the law offices of Washington & Associates. The contrast was stark. I was a man of sawdust and wood grain stepping into a world of glass, steel, and quiet, expensive carpeting. The air was cool and smelled faintly of paper and success. A young woman at a sleek white desk directed me to a corner office with a view that stretched over the entire city. Maya Washington was not what I expected. She was young, maybe early 30s, with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that didn't miss a thing. She wore a dark blue dress that was all business, but there was a warmth in her handshake that was genuine. Her office was modern and minimalist, but on her wall there was a large framed black and white photograph of a group of civil rights marchers, their faces determined and hopeful. I knew then that Diane had been right about her. I sat in the leather chair across from her desk. She began with the usual questions, her voice calm and professional. She was sizing me up, trying to fit my story into a neat legal box: family dispute, elder abuse, property contest. I let her ask her questions, answering them simply and directly. Yes, my daughter's name is Alicia. Yes, my son-in-law is Brandon Miller. Yes, I left the house of my own free will. I could see a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a professional skepticism. She probably heard stories like this every day, tangled emotional messes with no clear legal path forward. I didn't blame her. After I had given her the basic facts, I leaned forward and placed the heavy leather folder on her polished desk. The sound it made was soft, but it landed with the weight of 50 years. My wife Diane passed away 5 years ago, I said. She was a planner. She asked me to give this to you if the time ever came. Maya looked at the folder, then back at me. Her expression shifted slightly. This was no longer a standard consultation. She opened it. For a long moment, she just stared at the first page, the hand-drawn blueprint of the house. She ran her fingers lightly over my wife's handwriting. "Your wife drew this?" she asked, her voice softer now. "She did," I said. "She had an eye for things, for how things fit together." Maya turned the page, and then the next, and the next. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of paper. I watched her face as she worked her way through Diane's legacy. I saw her professional focus sharpen as she read through the land deeds, some dating back to the 1920s. I saw her brow furrow in concentration as she examined the photographs of my grandfather and his crew, their faces proud and serious as they stood before the half-finished frame of the house. Then she got to the newspaper clippings. They were old and yellowed from local black newspapers of the era, articles praising the craftsmanship of Wallace & Sons construction, celebrating my grandfather as a pillar of the community, a man who built things to last. I watched as her eyes moved faster, connecting the dots, seeing the story that Diane had so carefully laid out for her. This wasn't just a house. It was a landmark. It was a piece of history, a testament to a black family that had built and owned and thrived in a place long before men like Brandon saw it as just another asset to be flipped. Finally, she reached Diane's handwritten notes, the legal research she had done in the final months of her life. She had outlined the entire process for applying for historical preservation status. She had highlighted city ordinances, cited legal precedents, and even drafted the initial letters. It was a complete battle plan. Maya looked up from the folder, her eyes shining with a new light. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a fierce, focused energy. "Mr. Wallace," she said, and her voice was different now. It was the voice of an ally. Your wife was a brilliant woman." I just nodded, a lump forming in my throat. I managed to say, "she was a builder." Maya leaned forward, her hands flat on top of the open folder as if protecting it. "This is more than a property dispute," she said, her words coming faster now. "This is a preservation case. This is a legacy case. With this evidence, with this story, we don't just have a chance. We have a moral imperative." She explained the legal strategy building on the foundation Diane had laid. The first step was the application to the city's Historical Preservation Committee. She talked about legal injunctions and property liens. The words were complex, but the meaning was simple. We were going to build a fortress of paper and law around that house, a fortress that Brandon's money couldn't possibly break through. For the first time, she smiled. It was a real smile, sharp and determined. "He thinks he's in a real estate battle," she said. "He has no idea he's wandering into a history lesson. And, Mr. Wallace," she looked me straight in the eye, "I am an excellent teacher." When I walked out of her office an hour later, the city looked different. It didn't look like Brandon's city of deals and demolitions. It looked like my city. A city of stories, a city with history, a city with foundations strong enough to withstand any storm. The silence on my phone didn't feel like an absence anymore. It felt like the quiet before the work begins. I had my tools, I had my blueprint, and now I had my partner. It was time to start building. 3 days later, Maya and I found ourselves in a place that felt like the city's memory bank. Dr. Alistair Finch's office was not an office at all. It was a den of history. Books were stacked to the ceiling, old maps were spread out under glass on a massive wooden table, and the air smelled of old paper and leather. Dr. Finch himself was a short, energetic man in his late 60s with a tweed jacket and a bow tie that was slightly askew. His eyes, magnified by thick glasses, lit up with a child's curiosity when Maya began to lay out the contents of Diane's folder. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, his head cocked to one side, occasionally nodding as Maya explained the legal framework of our petition. When she was finished, he looked at me. "And you, Mr. Wallace," he said, his voice raspy but kind. "You grew up in this house." I told him I did. I told him about my father and my grandfather before him. I pushed the old black and white photographs across the table toward him. He picked one up with a surprising gentleness, a photo of my grandfather and his crew. "Wallace and Sons," he whispered, more to himself than to us. Of course, I should have made the connection. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with discovery. "Mr. Wallace, your grandfather wasn't just a builder, he was an artist. There are maybe 5-6 buildings left in this city that still have his signature joinery work. He never used a single nail in his structural beams. It was all mortise and tenon perfectly fitted. It was a technique he brought with him from the Carolinas. People called it the Wallace lock. It was said a house built by your grandfather could withstand a hurricane." My own breath caught in my chest. I had always known my grandfather was a good carpenter, but I had never understood the depth of his legacy. It was a family story, not a piece of history. Dr. Finch stood up and shuffled over to a large, flat filing cabinet. He pulled open a wide drawer and carefully lifted out a massive leather-bound ledger. He laid it on the table and opened it. It was a city planning ledger from 1931. He ran his finger down a list of permits until he stopped. "There," he said, tapping the page. "Permit number 482, Wallace and Sons Construction, Lot 17 Elm Street. See here?" He pointed to a note in the margin written in elegant cursive. "Notable for its cantilevered porch design and extensive use of heart pine, a rarity for residential construction of the period." He looked up at us, his face beaming. "This isn't just a house, Ms. Washington. It's a prototype. It's one of the first examples of a black-owned construction company blending traditional Southern building techniques with the modern aesthetics of the time. It is, quite frankly, invaluable." He then proceeded to give us more than we could have ever hoped for. He had anecdotes passed down from other historians, stories of my grandfather's reputation for integrity, how he would guarantee his work for 50 years. He provided copies of academic papers that mentioned his company's work. He gave us a context, a narrative that transformed our legal petition into an undeniable claim on the city's soul. He was giving us the words to describe what I had always felt in my bones, that the house was more than wood and nails. It was a living thing imbued with the spirit of the men who built it. As we packed up Diane's folder, now much thicker with the documents Dr. Finch had given us, he placed a hand on my arm. "Your son-in-law," he said, his voice now serious. "He doesn't want to tear down a house. He wants to erase a history. We cannot let that happen." Leaving his office, the city air felt different again. I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore. I was fighting for my grandfather's name. I was fighting for the story of the Wallace lock, for the strength in those beams, for the quiet dignity of building something meant to last. Brandon thought he was buying property. He had no idea he was picking a fight with history itself. And history, I was learning, had very deep roots. I wasn't there to see it, of course, but I can picture the scene as clearly as if I had built it myself. The letter from Maya Washington's office would have arrived on a Tuesday, a crisp, cream-colored envelope tucked between a glossy furniture catalog and the water bill. It would have felt important, official, a piece of a world that Brandon desperately wanted to conquer. He probably saw the embossed logo of the law firm and felt a flicker of annoyance, assuming it was a complaint from a contractor or some other minor nuisance. I can see him slitting it open with a silver letter opener, his movements sharp and impatient. Alicia would have been in the kitchen, probably on the phone, trying to find a plumber who could fix the mysterious gurgling sound in the pipes that had started a few days earlier. Brandon would have scanned the first few lines, his expression of annoyance slowly melting into a look of smug satisfaction. I can almost hear the sound of his short, sharp laugh. The kind of laugh that doesn't come from joy, but from a deep, unshakable sense of superiority. He would have tossed the letter onto the granite countertop. "Well, what do you know?" he would have said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The prodigal father wants to talk." Alicia would have ended her call, her face a mixture of hope and fear. "What is it?" He would have leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms, the picture of a man in complete control. "It's a summons to his new lawyer's office. It looks like the old man has finally run out of motel money. He wants to negotiate. He said the word negotiate as if it were a dirty thing something lesser people did. For him, there were only winners and losers, conquests and surrenders. He picked up the letter again, folding it neatly and tucking it into his jacket pocket. He was a man accepting an invitation to his own victory celebration. He had no idea he wasn't preparing for a negotiation. He was preparing to walk into a history lesson he was destined to fail. The conference room in Maya Washington's office felt like a different world. The long, dark wood table was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the cool, modern lights from the ceiling. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window, the city bustled on, but in this room the air was still and heavy with purpose. I sat on one side of the table with Maya to my right and Dr. Alistair Finch to my left. We didn't speak. We were a silent, united front. I felt a deep calm, the kind a carpenter feels when he knows his measurements are true and his tools are sharp. The work was about to begin. When the door opened, Brandon strode in first, a confident, predatory smile already on his face. He had dressed for a victory, wearing an expensive suit and a brightly colored tie. Alicia trailed behind him, looking small and nervous. She clutched her purse like a shield. Brandon's smile faltered the moment he saw us. He was expecting to see me, a lonely old man he could easily intimidate. He was not expecting my sharp, impeccably dressed lawyer, and he certainly was not expecting the distinguished-looking man with a tweed jacket and a serious expression. The confident energy he had walked in with seemed to evaporate into the cool, conditioned air. He and Alicia took the seats opposite us, the vast, polished table stretching between us like a chasm. Maya let the silence sit for a moment before she began. Her voice was calm, professional, and as sharp as a freshly honed chisel. "Thank you for coming, Mr. and Mrs. Miller," she said. "I am Maya Washington, counsel for Jeremiah Wallace, and this," she gestured to the man beside me, "is Dr. Alistair Finch from the City Heritage Committee." I watched Brandon's eyes dart from Maya to Dr. Finch and then back again. The gears in his head were grinding, trying to process a piece that didn't fit into his simple puzzle of greed and power. A heritage committee. What did that have to do with anything? "The purpose of this meeting," Maya continued, her hands folded neatly on the table, "is to inform you of a recent and significant development regarding the property located at 17 Elm Street." Brandon leaned forward, his arrogance returning. If my father-in-law has a financial request, he could have just called. Maya ignored him completely. Her gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. As of 9 a.m. this morning, the City Heritage Committee has voted unanimously to grant the property provisional historical landmark status. The words dropped into the silent room like stones into a still pond. Alicia gasped a small, quiet sound. Brandon just stared. For a full 10 seconds, he said nothing. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a brittle sound. "You're kidding me," he said, looking around the table as if expecting everyone else to join in the joke. "A historical landmark, it's just an old house on a valuable piece of land." Dr. Finch cleared his throat. "It is, in fact, one of the most well-preserved examples of pre-war residential construction by a black-owned firm in this city's history," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It is anything but just an old house." Brandon's face flushed a deep red. His mask of control was cracking. He turned his glare on me. "This is your doing, isn't it? Some pathetic little trick because you were mad about a party. This is unbelievable." He turned back to Maya, his voice rising. "This is meaningless. A provisional status. My lawyers will tear this apart in 5 minutes. This changes nothing. We will still sell the house." Alicia, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke. Her voice was a whisper. "Daddy." She was looking at me, really looking at me, perhaps for the first time in years. In my eyes, she wasn't seeing a tired old man anymore. She was seeing a strategist, a man who had a plan she couldn't comprehend. I held her gaze but remained silent. My silence was my answer. This was my house, my legacy, and I was not the one on the defensive anymore. Brandon was still talking, still blustering about his legal team and his rights as the... He paused, realizing his mistake. He had no rights here. It wasn't his name on the deed. He was a guest who had overstayed his welcome, and the real owners of the house, both living and dead, were finally asking him to leave. Brandon's laugh was gone, replaced by a red-faced fury. "This changes nothing," he He spat across the polished table, pointing a finger first at Maya, then at me. My lawyers will have this ridiculous landmark status thrown out in a week. You can't just decide a house is suddenly a museum. It's my house. His voice cracked on the last word, a slip of possession that hung in the air like a lie. Alicia flinched beside him. Maya didn't even blink. She let his anger echo in the silent room until it died out, leaving only the sound of his heavy breathing. She weighted her calm, a weapon more powerful than his rage. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, cutting. "Your house, Mr. Miller? That's an interesting assumption." She slowly, deliberately slid a bound document across the gleaming wood. It stopped directly in front of him. "The landmark status is only the first lock on the door," she said. "This is the second." Brandon stared at the document as if it were a snake. The cover page read, "The Last Will and Testament of Diane Wallace." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of panic. "What is this?" he demanded. "You have no right." "Oh, I have every right," Maya replied smoothly. "As the legal counsel for the executor of the will, please turn to page 4, section 3, paragraph B." Brandon's hands trembled slightly as he opened the document. Alicia leaned in her eyes, scanning the page alongside his. I knew the words by heart. I had read them 100 times in my quiet motel room. Maya recited them from memory, her voice a calm, steady drumbeat of destiny. "In the event of my husband Jeremiah Wallace's death, or in the event that he is no longer able or willing to reside at the property of 17 Elm Street, sole ownership of said property shall not pass to my daughter Alicia Miller. Instead, it is to be transferred in its entirety to a community trust established for the preservation of local architectural history." Brandon's head snapped up. He looked at Alicia, his face a mask of betrayal. "You knew about this," he hissed. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, I never..." She looked at me, her expression lost and bewildered. Of course she didn't know. Diane and I had kept this between us, a final safeguard for a future my wife had seen more clearly than any of us. Before Brandon could even form another protest, Maya slid a second, newer document next to the will. "And this," she said, "is the charter for the Wallace Heritage Trust, legally incorporated last week with Mr. Wallace as its chairman, and a board composed of community leaders and historians, including Dr. Finch here." Brandon was no longer angry. He looked stunned, as if he couldn't process the information. He was a shark who had suddenly found himself in a desert. The rules he understood no longer applied. Maya delivered the final blow. "The Trust's primary legally binding mandate is to convert the property at 17 Elm Street into a museum and a tuition-free workshop dedicated to teaching traditional building crafts to a new generation of artisans." That was it. That was the sound of his world ending. It wasn't just that he couldn't sell the house. It wasn't just that he couldn't demolish it. The house was being turned into the permanent living monument of everything he had tried to erase. It was a fortress of legacy planted right in the center of his empire of glass and greed. For the first time I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "You saw a house, Brandon," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "You saw square footage. You saw an asset. You saw something old that you could tear down to build something new and profitable." I paused, then looked at my daughter. But Diane, she saw a foundation. My grandfather laid that foundation with his bare hands. We built a family on it. We built a life in it. Every floorboard, every beam holds a story. It was never just wood and nails. It was a promise to our community that we had a place here, a promise to our family that we would always have a home. My gaze fell on Alicia, whose tears were now flowing freely. "When you stood by in my workshop and said nothing, you let him try to tear down that promise. This isn't about getting revenge, Alicia. This is about keeping a promise that is bigger than you and bigger than me." Brandon wasn't listening. He had sunk back into his chair, the color completely drained from his face. His eyes were unfocused. I knew what he was seeing. He wasn't seeing us anymore. He was seeing the phone calls he would have to make to his investors. He was seeing the collapse of his entire development plan, a plan that hinged on acquiring that central property. The Wallace house was the keystone, and we had just pulled it out. His arch of ambition had crumbled into dust. Maya gathered her papers, her movements crisp and final. "The trust will be in contact regarding a timeline for you to vacate the premises," she said. "I believe this meeting is over. 6 months later, the air in the house has changed. It no longer holds its breath. Instead, it breathes with a new life filled with the scent of fresh-cut pine and the sound of creation. The tense silence has been replaced by the scrape of a handplane against wood, the rhythmic tap of a mallet, and the low, focused murmur of young people learning a craft. Next to the front door I built so long ago, a simple brass plaque now reads, "The Wallace Heritage Center." I was in the workshop showing a young woman how to read the grain in a piece of maple, how to find the story within the wood when I saw her. Alicia was standing at the edge of the lawn alone. She watched for a while, a quiet observer of this new world that had grown in the space where her old one had collapsed. She walked over, and the students, with a quiet respect, gave us space. She didn't have any grand speeches or tearful apologies. Words would have felt hollow anyway. Instead, she held out a small, long, velvet-lined box. I opened it. Inside, nestled against the dark blue velvet, was a single beautiful chisel. The steel was polished to a mirror finish, and the handle was made of rosewood, smooth and perfectly weighted. It was not a tool for a beginner. It was a tool for a master. It was the finest tool I had ever held in my hand. It was an apology and a peace offering spoken in the only language that could truly reach me now. The language of respect for the craft. The language of my life's work. I took the chisel from the box, feeling its perfect balance in my palm. I looked from the tool, a symbol of a future, to my daughter's face, a link to my past. I gave a single slow nod. It was enough. It was a start. She gave a small, watery smile in return, and after a moment turned and walked away. The healing would be a slow process built piece by piece, but for the first time the foundation felt solid again. As I watched her go, the new chisel, heavy and right in my hand, I understood. Brandon saw a house to be torn down. For a while, Alicia saw a burden to be managed. And for a moment even I had seen it as only a memory to be defended. But it was always meant to be something more. It's a beginning. It's a promise not just kept, but shared. I've learned that a home isn't just the walls you build to keep the world out. It's the doors you keep open to let the future in. It's the legacy you don't just protect, but pass into younger, eager hands. My wife Diane laid the blueprint. And now on the foundation my grandfather built, we are creating the future, one piece of carefully measured wood at a time. I turned back to my students, ready to continue the lesson. This story teaches us that dignity is not something others can take from you. It can only be surrendered. When faced with profound disrespect, the most powerful response is rarely a loud argument, but quiet, intelligent action. It's a reminder that our true worth is measured not by our financial value to others, but by the integrity with which we honor our own story and the legacy of those who came before us. Sometimes the most carefully laid plans, rooted in love and foresight, create the loudest statements, proving that history and self-respect are foundations that can never be demolished. If you believe in the power of honoring your legacy, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories.